From now on your paycheck goes into my account. You don't need anything anyway, my daughter said. I quietly agreed. That night she and her husband came over for free dinner like always. But when they walked in, they screamed in shock. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The scent of Christmas in my Baltimore row house used to be a specific comforting alchemy of baking gingerbread, fresh pine from the tree in the corner, and the faint clean smell of the winter air that snuck in through the old window frames. This year a new discordant note had been added to the symphony, the cloying fruity aroma of my daughter's vape pen, a smell that clung to the festive decorations and seemed to mock the quiet dignity of the season. I stood in my kitchen, a place that had been the warm, beating heart of this family for 30 years, and felt a weariness that went bone deep. My hands, still strong but mapped with the fine lines of 62 years, methodically kneaded dough for the morning cinnamon rolls. Outside, a gentle Maryland snow was beginning to fall, dusting the quiet street in a blanket of pristine white. It was a picture-perfect Christmas Eve. A Currier and Ives print, and I, Brenda, the matriarch of this paid-off house, felt like a ghost haunting my own holiday. My daughter, Alicia, was the source of this profound soul-crushing exhaustion. At 27 she was a magnificent hollow creature. She was currently draped across my living room sofa, a place where her father, Robert, used to sit and read the paper every Sunday morning. She wasn't reading, she was curating. Her phone was held aloft, her face a perfect contoured mask of manufactured bliss as she took a series of selfies. The beautifully decorated Christmas tree a calculated prop in the background of her performance. Holiday vibes, she murmured to her unseen audience. Her voice a low, seductive purr that was utterly alien in this house of warm, honest emotions. Just relaxing and letting Mom handle all the hard work. Blessed Christmas Eve, family time. I watched her from the kitchen doorway, a silent, invisible figure in my own home. She was a self-proclaimed content creator, a brand influencer, though the only brand she influenced was her own relentless, insatiable entitlement. Her life was a performance and I was the unwilling, unpaid stage crew, the silent, financial backer, and the weary, in-house maid. Her husband, Kyle, a man whose entrepreneurial ventures were as frequent as they were fruitless, was her chief enabler. He sat in Robert's old armchair, scrolling through his own phone, a silent, supportive co-conspirator in their shared life of leisure. This house, this solid brick two-story, was the culmination of a lifetime of hard work. My late husband, Robert, a city bus driver for 40 years, and I, a registered nurse who had worked more double shifts than I could count, had poured our sweat, our savings and our dreams into this place. We had paid it off 3 years before he passed. A moment of quiet, monumental triumph. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, my fortress of solitude in my retirement. Instead, it had become Alicia and Kyle's home base. They had moved back in after their wedding with a vague promise to get on their feet, and 3 years later their feet were still firmly planted on my coffee table, usually clad in a pair of outrageously expensive designer sneakers that I had in some indirect way paid for. Neither of them had a steady job. They did not pay rent. They did not cook or clean or contribute in any meaningful way to the household. They simply existed. They consumed, they took up space, both physical and emotional, with the thoughtless, all-encompassing confidence of a black hole. My quiet, peaceful retirement had become a third shift, a new unpaid job as the caretaker and financier of my own adult child's prolonged adolescence. My patience, a quality I had honed over a lifetime of nursing, had been worn down to a dangerously thin, frayed thread. Every selfie she took, every discarded dish she left on the counter, every casual, entitled demand she made, was another small, sharp snip at that thread. And I knew with a certainty that was as cold and as heavy as the snow outside, that the thread was about to break. I was a servant in the house I owned, a stranger in the life I had built. The grand plan was unveiled 3 days before Christmas, over a dinner of takeout Thai food that I had of course paid for. Alicia and Kyle approached the subject with the practiced tag team finesse of seasoned con artists. They had laid the groundwork for weeks, with vague excited whispers about a major networking opportunity and the importance of brand synergy during the holidays. Alicia began, her fork suspended dramatically over her pad. "See you, Mom," she said, her voice a carefully calibrated instrument of excitement and serious professional ambition. "Kyle and I have been thinking, Christmas Eve is the perfect opportunity for us to make a huge splash. All of my most important contacts, the big influencers, are going to be in town, and they're all looking for something to do." I just nodded, chewing my food slowly, my face a mask of neutral maternal interest. I knew a pitch when I saw one. I had sat through 1,000 of them from pharmaceutical reps in the hospital cafeteria. It's a prime time slot for engagement, Kyle chimed in, using one of the buzzwords he had picked up from a podcast. A Christmas Eve party right here. It would be epic. The content we could create, it would be a game changer for Alicia's brand. They were not talking about a family gathering. They were not talking about a quiet, festive evening with loved ones. They were talking about a business event, a piece of live-streamed content, a performance, and my home, my quiet, sacred Christmas Eve sanctuary, was to be their soundstage. A party sounds like a lot of work, I said, my voice deliberately tired, a gentle maternal pushback. Not for you, Alicia said with a bright, dismissive laugh. We'll handle everything. The guest list, the music, all the important stuff. We just need a little help with the logistics. And then came the presentation. Kyle pulled out his tablet and swiped it to life. On the screen was a detailed and utterly breathtakingly audacious budget proposal. It was presented as a mood board, a collection of glossy magazine-quality photos that represented their vision for the party. So for catering, Alicia began, pointing to a picture of a magnificent overflowing charcuterie board. We're thinking artisanal cheeses, imported cured meats, that kind of vibe. Very sophisticated, and for drinks. She swiped to a photo of a row of sparkling jewel-toned cocktails. We want to set up a craft cocktail bar. A mixologist, maybe, something really impressive. The list went on. Gourmet appetizers, a champagne tower, professional decorations, far beyond the simple, heartfelt ones I had already put up. A sound system rental, even a red carpet for the front walkway for the perfect arrival experience for her influencer friends. It was not a party, it was a corporate event, a product launch, and the product being launched was my daughter. I looked at the list, at the sheer unmitigated gall of it all. The estimated cost, which was conveniently absent from the mood board, would be thousands of dollars. It was a sum so far outside the realm of my perceived modest pension, that it was almost a work of absurdist comedy. This all looks very expensive, sweetheart, I said, my voice a quiet, gentle statement of the obvious. It's an investment, Mom, Kyle said, his voice a smooth, reasonable purr. You have to spend money to make money. This party, the connections Alicia will make, the content she'll create, it will pay for itself 10 times over. It's the final push her brand needs to really take off. They were not just asking me to fund a party, they were asking me to be their angel investor, to provide the seed capital for their fraudulent, non-existent business. They looked at me, their faces alight with a shared greedy and utterly, completely delusional enthusiasm. They were not asking, they were expecting. They saw me not as their mother but as their first and easiest mark, and they were waiting for me to sign the check. I looked from the glossy impossible fantasy on Kyle's tablet screen to my daughter's expectant, entitled face. A lifetime of weary maternal capitulation was warring with a new and for me, entirely unfamiliar emotion. A cold, hard and tired sense of finality. The thread of my patience, which had been stretching and fraying for years, was now pulled so taut it was humming with a high, dangerous and almost musical tension. No? I said. The word was a small, quiet and utterly revolutionary thing. It was a word I had not said to my daughter in any meaningful way. In over a decade. It was a word that did not seem to exist in her vocabulary. She stared at me, her perfectly glossed lips parted in a look of pure, uncomprehending shock. What? She stammered. What do you mean no? I mean no, Alicia, I repeated, my voice still quiet, but with an underlying bedrock of a resolve she had never encountered before. I'm sorry, but I can't afford this. I'm a retired woman, living on a fixed income. A champagne tower and a private mixologist are not in my budget. I was still playing my part, the role of the modest pension-drawing mother. I was giving her a logical, reasonable and financially sound explanation for my refusal. It was an olive branch, a final desperate attempt to appeal to the rational adult woman I still foolishly hoped existed somewhere inside the selfish, demanding child. She did not take the olive branch. She saw it as an act of war. Her face, which had been a mask of excited, ambitious energy, transformed. The beautiful curated features hardened into an ugly contorted mask of pure unadulterated rage. Not in your budget, she shrieked, her voice rising to a high piercing pitch that made my ears ring. Are you kidding me? This is a paid-off house, Mom. You have no expenses. What are you even doing with all your money? I am living, Alicia, I said, my voice still calm, a small quiet island in the hurricane of her fury. I am paying my bills. I am saving for my own future. For any potential medical emergencies. I am being a responsible adult. The last words were a gentle but pointed dart. It hit its mark. Responsible? She spat, the word an insult. You're being selfish. You're hoarding your money while your own daughter, your own family is trying to build a future. This isn't just a party, it's my career, and you're trying to sabotage it. That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? I said, my calm seeming to enrage her even further. I'll show you dramatic, she hissed, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure venomous fury. She stood up, her movements jerky and aggressive. I knew this would happen. I knew you weren't capable of managing your own finances anymore. You're getting old, Mom. You're losing track of things. Kyle, my silent enabling son-in-law, chose this moment to make his move. He stood up and put a comforting, supportive arm around his wife's shoulders. Alicia's right, Brenda, he said, his voice a low, sorrowful and manipulative murmur. We've been worried about you. You seem confused lately. We just want to help. They were a team, a pair of circling predatory wolves, and they were closing in for the kill. And then, Alicia delivered the final fatal and utterly unforgivable demand. She walked to the small printer in the corner of the room and picked up a piece of paper she had. I now realized with a chilling certainty, printed out before this conversation had even begun, she had been prepared for my refusal. She had been waiting for this moment. She slapped the paper down on the table in front of me. It was a direct deposit authorization form for my Social Security check. You're right, Mom, she said, her voice now a cold, clinical and terrifyingly calm thing. You're getting old, you can't be trusted with your own money anymore. So from now on your paycheck goes into my account. I'll manage it for you. I'll give you an allowance for your little groceries and things. She looked at me, her eyes as cold and as hard as a banker's heart. You don't need anything anyway, she said, the words a final, brutal and satisfying declaration of her own monstrousness. The thread had not just broken, it had been incinerated. I stared at the direct deposit form on the table, at the neat, black and white grid that was a blueprint for my own financial and personal annihilation. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, had just declared me incompetent, had appointed herself my financial guardian, and had summarily and with a breathtaking casual cruelty, stripped me of my own autonomy. A storm of emotions raged inside me. There was the hot, searing pain of her betrayal. There was the cold, sharp fury at her audacity, and there was a profound, soul-crushing grief for the daughter I had lost, the sweet little girl who had been replaced by this monstrous, grasping stranger. I could have fought her. I could have screamed. I could have cried. I could have thrown the form in her face and ordered her out of my house. The old Brenda, the weary but still fighting Brenda, would have done just that. It would have been a terrible, ugly and ultimately useless scene. It would have been a battle in a war I now realized I had been losing for years. But the woman who sat at that table was not the old Brenda. She was a new creature, a woman who had in the past few terrible moments, been pushed past the breaking point and had discovered not a void but a core of pure, cold and unyielding resolve. And so, I did not fight. I surrendered. But it was a different kind of surrender. It was not an act of weakness. It was an act of profound and satisfying strategic power. I looked up from the form and I smiled. It was a serene, weary smile, a perfect, brilliant performance of maternal defeat. You know what, dear? I said, my voice a soft, tired sigh. You're right, I have been having trouble keeping track of things lately. It's a lot to manage on my own. Maybe this is for the best. My capitulation was so swift, so complete, that it momentarily stunned them. They had been braced for a fight, for a dramatic emotional battle. My quiet, easy agreement was a victory they had not been prepared for. A look of pure, unadulterated and ugly triumph spread across Alicia's face. She had won. She had won so easily. She exchanged a smug, knowing glance with her husband. Their plan, their brilliant, simple plan, had worked perfectly. The old woman had been managed. I knew you'd understand, Mom, she said, her voice now a soft, magnanimous purr, the voice of a benevolent dictator who has just successfully and bloodlessly crushed a minor rebellion. It's just to help you, to take the burden off your shoulders. I know, sweetheart, I said, my voice a whisper of grateful senile compliance. I picked up a pen from the table. Where do I sign? She showed me, her perfectly manicured finger pointing to the signature line, a gesture of a parent guiding a small, slightly slow child. I took the direct deposit form. I looked at the routing number and the account number for her personal checking account, the account into which my life was now supposed to flow. And then, with a hand that was surprisingly, beautifully steady, I filled out the form. I wrote down my social security number. I wrote down my name, and in the space for the bank account information, I wrote down a series of numbers, and then I signed it. A neat, clear and perfectly legally binding signature. I slid the completed form across the table to her. "There you go, dear," I said. "You're in charge now." She took the form, her eyes scanning it with a quick proprietary glance. She did not of course recognize that the account number was not hers. She just saw a series of numbers, a string of data that represented her victory. "Thank you, Mom," she said, the words a thoughtless, dismissive and satisfying final insult. She folded the paper and tucked it into her purse, a trophy from a battle she had no idea she had just catastrophically and irrevocably lost. She and Kyle left shortly after that, their faces alight with a shared greedy and utterly completely oblivious triumph. They were on their way to begin planning their party to spend the $500 I had yet to give them, to celebrate their own brilliant and stupid victory. As they left, Alicia had delivered one final arrogant command. "Hey Mom," she'd said, her voice a cheerful casual thing. "We're coming over for dinner before the party on Christmas Eve. Make that pot roast we like, and don't forget to clean up." I just smiled, my serene, empty smile. "Of course, dear," I had said. "See you at 7. The trap was not just set. The bait had been taken, and the door had just been slammed and bolted shut. The moment the front door closed behind them, the moment the sound of their triumphant, laughing voices had faded down the street, the mask of the weary, compliant mother dissolved. The actress left the stage, and the real Brenda, the woman who had been hiding behind that mask for years, finally and with a profound and satisfying sense of liberation, emerged. I did not weep. I did not rage. I walked, with a calm, deliberate, and utterly focused purpose, to the phone. The time for quiet, passive suffering was over. It was time to activate the plan. It was time to call my sister. Denise answered on the first ring, her voice a sharp, no-nonsense hello. "It's time," I said, my voice a quiet, simple and utterly final declaration. There was a brief, loaded pause on her end, and then her voice came back, a low, efficient hum of a general who has just been given the order to advance. "It happened? She did it. She did it," I confirmed. "The direct deposit form? The whole ugly and beautifully scripted performance. She has the form. She believes she has won." "That little," Denise began, a string of creative, furious curses that was her own unique and comforting love language. She cut herself off, her voice shifting from sisterly rage to professional, strategic calm. "Okay," she said, "the new condo is ready, the moving truck is on standby, I can have them at your house by 2 a.m. Christmas morning. Are you absolutely sure about this, Bren? Once we start, there is no going back." Her question was not a challenge to my resolve. It was a final, necessary and loving check. She needed to know that this was not another moment of my usual weary frustration, another false alarm. She needed to know that this was the real thing, that the line had been crossed, and that I was finally, truly and irrevocably ready to burn the bridge. "I'm sure, Denise," I said, and my voice was as steady and as solid as a block of granite. I looked around my warm, comfortable living room, at the beautiful Christmas tree, at the festive, happy decorations, and I felt not a pang of sadness, but a profound and satisfying sense of detachment. This was no longer my home. It was a stage set, and the final dramatic act was about to begin. "She sold her grandfather's ring," I added, my voice a quiet, simple and utterly devastating statement of fact. "That's all I needed to hear," Denise said, her voice now cold, hard and utterly focused. "The plan is active. I'll be there at 1:30 myself to help you with the personal items. The crew will arrive at 2. We will be out by 5. Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready for years," I said, and it was the truest thing I had said in a very long time. We hung up, and I stood in the quiet of my home. A quiet, 62-year-old woman who was about to execute a secret, life-altering plan with the precision and the ruthlessness of a military operation. This was not a spur-of-the-moment, emotional decision. This was a carefully planned, long-term and brilliantly executed exit strategy. A code-red protocol that Denise, my fierce, practical and loving sister, had been helping me build for months. It had all started with a simple, desperate and for me shame-filled phone call 3 months prior. It was after a particularly ugly incident where Alicia had borrowed my credit card without asking, and had run up a $2,000 bill on a single impulsive shopping spree. I had been weeping on the phone to Denise, a familiar pathetic litany of my own maternal helplessness, and Denise, for the first time, had not offered sympathy. She had offered a solution. "That's it," she had said, her voice a sharp definitive snap that had cut through my tears. "We're done. We are not having this conversation again. We are getting you out of there." And so the plan had begun. The quiet, secret and terrifying war for my own liberation. The cornerstone of my daughter's breathtaking entitlement, and the foundation of my own secret liberation plan was a lie. A quiet, passive and satisfying lie of omission that I had cultivated for her entire adult life. Alicia, in her world of flashy performative wealth, believed her mother to be a woman of modest and rapidly dwindling means. She saw my life, the paid-off but unassuming row house, the sensible 10-year-old sedan, the simple comfortable clothes, and she saw a woman who was living on a fixed income, a combination of my late husband's small pension and my own monthly social security check. She saw a woman whose best financial years were long behind her, a woman who was now an asset to be managed, a small respectable but ultimately limited estate to be patiently waited for. She had no idea who I really was. She had no idea that her father, Robert, the quiet, steady and unassuming city bus driver, had been a quiet, steady and absolutely brilliant stock market investor. He had been a man of simple tastes but of a profound and analytical mind. He had started with a small inheritance from his own father, and over the course of 40 years with a patient, "You don't give a child a fish, Brenda," he used to tell me, his voice a low, rumbling and wise thing. "You teach them how to fish, and you certainly don't tell them there's a freezer full of fish in the basement, or they'll never ever learn to bait a hook." And so, we had kept it a secret. We had lived our comfortable but modest life. We had raised Alicia to believe that money was something you worked for, that a life of dignity was something you built, not something you inherited. But somewhere along the way the lesson had failed to take. She had seen our lack of extravagance, not as a sign of our discipline, but as a sign of our lack, and she had grown up with a resentful hunger for the very things we had tried to teach her were unimportant. When Robert had passed, he had left it all to me. The entire multi-million-dollar portfolio, a quiet digital empire of stocks, bonds and mutual funds that was now managed by a discreet and very expensive financial advisor. The paycheck that my daughter, in her infinite arrogant wisdom, had just seized control of, was my monthly social security deposit. A sum so laughably, pathetically small in comparison to my true net worth that it was a rounding error. It was the crumbs from the table of a feast she had never even known existed. And now, this secret, this quiet, powerful, and satisfying secret, was the ultimate weapon in my arsenal. Alicia believed she had just seized control of my entire financial world. She believed she had captured the queen. She had, in fact, just captured a single, insignificant and ultimately decoy pawn. The direct deposit form I had so meekly and so obediently filled out was a masterpiece of my own quiet and satisfying deception. It was a real form, with my real social security number, but the account and routing numbers I had written on it were not for her personal checking account. They were not even for my own primary account. On the advice of my financial advisor, a man who was as shrewd as he was discreet, I had 2 months ago opened a brand new secondary checking account in my own name at a completely different bank. An account that Alicia had no knowledge of and no access to. An account into which my monthly government-issued paycheck would now be quietly and safely deposited. The form I had given to my daughter, the one she now held in her purse like a captured flag, was a clever and legally brilliant forgery. The account and routing numbers on that form were for a different account altogether. An old forgotten savings account that I had not used in years. An account that currently held a grand total of $11.42. An account that would of course be receiving no new funds. Alicia, a woman who did not even know how to balance her own checkbook, would file the form, and she would wait for the money to start flowing in. And she would wait, and she would wait, and she would wait, and the money would never come. The trap was not just a physical one, it was a financial one, a beautiful, elegant and utterly inescapable snare, and my brilliant, arrogant and financially illiterate daughter had just walked right into it, with a triumphant, self-satisfied smile on her face. The direct deposit form was a work of deceptive art, a quiet, bureaucratic masterpiece of revenge. The beauty of it was in its simplicity, its utter unassailable logic. Alicia, a woman who lived her life in a world of vague aspirational concepts like branding and influence, had no understanding of the cold, hard and unforgiving mechanics of the financial world. She saw a form, a signature, and she saw a victory. She did not see the digital, invisible and utterly insurmountable wall she was about to run into at a very high speed. The plan had been conceived by my financial advisor, a man named Mr. Abernathy, a quiet, brilliant and loyal old-school gentleman who had managed my and Robert's portfolio for over 20 years. When I had, with a profound and shame-filled heart, laid out the situation with my daughter, he had not offered sympathy, he had offered a strategy. "The problem, Brenda," he had explained, his voice a calm, precise and comforting hum, "is that your daughter sees you as a resource, not a person. A resource that she believes she is entitled to. Our objective, therefore, is not to punish her but to re-educate her. We must teach her the fundamental economic principle of scarcity. And so, we had created the decoy. The old dormant savings account at a local credit union was the perfect vehicle. It was a ghost in my financial machine. An account with my name on it but with no real functional purpose. The account and routing numbers were real. The form was legal. But the outcome would be a quiet, frustrating and educational. Nothing. Alicia would take the form to her bank. A triumphant, conquering hero. The bank would process it, and on the first of the month when my Social Security deposit was made, it would be electronically routed not to her account, not to the decoy account, but to my new secret and completely untouchable account at a different bank. Alicia's account would receive nothing. The decoy account would receive nothing. The system would in essence simply and quietly fail. When she inevitably called her bank to complain, they would tell her that the problem was not on their end. They would tell her to check with the Social Security Administration. When she called them, a feat of bureaucratic patience she was singularly unequipped for, they would tell her that the deposit had been made successfully to the account number on file. Her account number on file, the one I had just established, was of course my new secret one. She would be trapped in a Kafkaesque, administrative nightmare of her own making. She would have the form, the proof of her authority, but it would be a key to a lock that had been changed. It was a perfect and perfectly legal act of financial gaslighting. And the beauty of it was all my idea. The initial emotional and satisfying part of the plan, the midnight move, the empty house, the final dramatic reveal that was Denise's brainchild. But this quiet, bureaucratic and utterly soul-crushingly frustrating financial trap, this was mine. I was an accountant's daughter after all. I understood the quiet, devastating power of a well-placed decimal point. As I sat in the quiet of my home, the sounds of my daughter's party, a distant muffled thud through the walls, I felt a surge of a new and unfamiliar emotion. It was the thrill of the game. I had spent my entire life being the responsible one, the caretaker, the quiet, competent and utterly predictable nurse. I had never been the plotter. I had never been the strategist. I had never been the quiet, smiling and satisfied architect of my own brilliant and long overdue revenge. The house, the furniture, the food, those were just the stage props. The real and lasting pain I was about to inflict upon my daughter was not going to be physical. It was going to be administrative. I was about to introduce her to the beautiful, frustrating and educational world of consequences. A world where forms matter, where numbers have to add up, and where the Bank of Mom, with its generous and utterly forgiving overdraft protection, was no longer open for business. The days between that final ugly confrontation and Christmas Eve were a strange, surreal and liberating period of quiet, purposeful and clandestine activity. On the surface I was the same, weary and now completely defeated. Brenda, I played my part to perfection. I sighed. I looked tired. I spent most of my time in my room, a performance that Alicia and Kyle interpreted as a pouting geriatric sulk. They left me alone, their victory so complete, so absolute, that my presence was now just a minor, and soon to be remedied annoyance. They, in the meantime, were in a state of triumphant, frenzied, and obnoxious celebration. They were on the phone constantly, their voices loud and full of a new, arrogant authority as they invited their friends to the epic Christmas Eve party. They went on a series of massive, extravagant shopping sprees, buying new outfits, expensive decorations and a truly breathtaking amount of high-end liquor. They were spending money they did not have, with a confidence that was born of a PA and flawed belief that my money was now officially their money. In all the while, in the quiet, unseen corners of their victory, I was orchestrating my great escape. The Great Evacuation, as my sister Denise had so dramatically and so accurately dubbed it, was a masterpiece of logistical planning. It was a reverse heist, a quiet, methodical and utterly comprehensive extraction of my entire life from the house that had become my prison. The first phase was the small things, the things I could do myself under the cover of their arrogant, self-absorbed obliviousness. While they were out shopping, I moved through the house like a quiet, efficient and sorrowful ghost. I packed the things that mattered most, the artifacts of my soul. I took the old leather-bound photo albums, a complete visual history of our family from the happy, hopeful days of my marriage to the innocent, gap-toothed smiles of my daughter as a child. I packed my mother's delicate porcelain tea set, the one I had kept in the display cabinet for 30 years. I packed Robert's favorite worn-out tweed jacket, which still hung in the back of my closet, and which still faintly smelled of him. These were the things I could not bear to leave behind. They were the pieces of my heart, and I was taking them with me. I packed them into a series of small, unmarked cardboard boxes, and late one night, While they were out at a celebratory dinner, I loaded them into my own car and drove them to my new waiting condo. The one that required the kind of ruthless, unsentimental efficiency that only my sister Denise could provide. She had hired the moving company, a discreet, professional and very expensive outfit that specialized in after-hours executive relocations. They were, in essence, a team of professional ghosts, experts in making large, valuable things disappear in the middle of the night, quickly, quietly, and with no questions asked. The plan was set for the early hours of Christmas morning, a time when the world would be asleep, when my daughter and her friends would be in a drunken and utterly oblivious slumber. The timing was not just practical, it was poetic. I was going to give my daughter a Christmas she would never ever forget. A Christmas of a profound and educational emptiness. A Christmas where she would finally truly understand the meaning of the phrase, "You don't know what you've got till it's gone." The afternoon of Christmas Eve arrived. A day of strange, surreal and emotionally charged calm. I moved through the house, a quiet, serene actress in the final dramatic scene of a play that only I had the script for. The house was already a ghost of itself, its soul packed away in boxes, its heart already moved to a new, sunlit home on the other side of town, but the stage was still set, the props still in place for one final performance. Alicia and Kyle had been out all day, making the final extravagant and satisfyingly self-sabotaging preparations for their party. They had been to the gourmet market, to the liquor store, to the party supply warehouse. They had been spending my money, or rather the money they believed was about to be mine, with a reckless, joyful and utterly, completely oblivious abandon. At around 4 o'clock, as I was sitting in my bedroom, a room that was now almost completely bare save for the bed itself and a single packed suitcase, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Alicia. The message was a masterpiece of her own, unique and infuriating brand of casual, arrogant and breathtakingly entitled, cruelty. Hey, the text read, devoid of any greeting, any warmth, any of the festive spirit of the day. We're on our way back now to drop off the party stuff. Then we're going out for a quick drink with friends before the main event. We'll be back for dinner around 7. It was not a question, it was not an invitation for me to join them. It was a schedule, a decree issued by the new queen of the castle to her in-house, unpaid and now, officially, deposed cook. And then the final, arrogant command. Make that pot roast we like. The one with the carrots and potatoes. And don't forget to clean up the kitchen before we get back. I want the place to be perfect for my guests. I stared at the message, at the cold black digital letters on the screen, and I felt nothing. No anger, no hurt. The part of me that could be wounded by her words was gone, cauterized by the white-hot fire of my own quiet and satisfying resolve. Her words were no longer a source of pain. They were a source of a quiet, clinical and satisfying confirmation. I had made the right decision. This was not a daughter I was abandoning. This was a parasite I was finally, and with a profound and satisfying sense of relief, removed. I held my thumb over the keyboard, and I composed my reply. It was a simple, beautiful and utterly, completely and satisfying lie. Of course, dear. The pot roast is already in the oven. See you at 7. I hit send. The final piece of bait had been laid. The final comforting and utterly, completely and satisfying illusion of her mother's eternal, unconditional and utterly, completely and satisfying servitude was in place. She would come home at 7 expecting the warm, familiar and satisfying smells of a home-cooked meal. She would expect a clean kitchen, a set table, a mother waiting to serve her one last final and satisfying supper. The pot roast was not, of course, in the oven. The oven was cold and clean, and as empty as my heart was of any feeling for the monstrous, selfish and satisfyingly doomed young woman who was my daughter. The Last Supper would not be a feast, it would be a famine, and the menu for the first time in her life would consist of a single unpalatable unsatisfying dish, the cold, hard and unforgiving taste of consequences. The hours between my final deceptive text message and their scheduled arrival for dinner were the longest and the quietest of my life. I did not cook, I did not clean. I simply sat in the silent, empty shell of my former home and I waited. The house around me was a ghost, a hollowed-out memory, and I was the last, lingering spirit, waiting for the final, definitive moment of my own exorcism. At precisely 7 o'clock I heard the sound of their car in the driveway, the familiar arrogant roar of Kyle's oversized and soon-to-be repossessed SUV. I heard their laughter, a loud, bright and utterly oblivious sound in the quiet winter night. They were happy. They were triumphant. They were on their way to their party, to the pinnacle of their social lives, and all that stood between them and their glorious evening was a quick, free and delicious meal at the expense of the old woman they had so successfully and so recently conquered. I stood in the shadows of the empty dining room, my heart a quiet, steady and expectant drum. This was it. The final dramatic and satisfying scene. The front door opened, and they swept in, a gust of cold air and loud self-important energy. "Mom," Alicia called out, her voice a bright, cheerful and utterly false thing. "We're home. And we're starving. I hope that pot roast is as good as it smells in my imagination." But the house did not smell of pot roast. It did not smell of anything. It smelled of cold, empty and sterile silence. They stopped dead in the foyer. The abrupt, shocking and utter silence of the house was the first thing that hit them. The usual warm and welcoming glow of the living room lamps was gone. The house was dark, the only light a cold gray and unsettling wash from the streetlights outside. "Mom?" Alicia called again, her voice now a little smaller, a little less certain, a flicker of a new and for her, entirely, unfamiliar emotion confusion. They took a few, hesitant steps into the living room, and then, they stopped. Their eyes, accustomed to the warm, cluttered and festive landscape of my home, were now met with a scene of such stark, shocking and utterly incomprehensible emptiness, that their brains simply could not process it. The sofa was gone. The armchairs were gone. The Christmas tree with its mountain of presents was gone. The rugs, the lamps, the paintings, the very fabric of their known, and taken for granted world, had been vaporized. "What? What is this?" Kyle stammered, his voice a low, disbelieving whisper. Were we robbed?" Alicia didn't answer. She was standing frozen, her perfectly made-up face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. Her mind, which was so adept at processing the shallow, fleeting data of her social media feed, was completely and utterly short-circuiting in the face of this profound and unsettling new reality. And then she began to move. She stumbled, like a sleepwalker, from one empty room to the next. Her high heels, which were designed for the soft, forgiving landscape of expensive rugs, clicked with a loud, sharp and jarring sound on the bare hardwood floors. She went into the dining room. Empty. The family room. Empty. And then she ran her earlier, robotic movements now a frantic, panicked scramble into the kitchen. The kitchen, the heart of the home, the source of all its warmth and nourishment, was a tomb. The counters were bare, the cabinets were open and empty, and the refrigerator, the symbol of her mother's endless, unconditional and taken for granted provision, stood silent and cold and dark. The shock was a physical, visceral and satisfying thing. It was the look of a person who has not just been surprised, but who has had their entire fundamental understanding of the universe, of the very laws of physics, completely and irrevocably shattered. The house was not just empty, it was impossible. And in the face of that impossibility, my daughter, my strong, arrogant and entitled daughter, finally and with a beautiful, satisfying and cathartic finality, began to scream. Her scream was not a sound of fear or of grief. It was a raw, primal and infuriated cry of pure, unadulterated and baffled rage. It was the sound of a queen who has returned to her castle to find that not only have the servants vanished, but they have taken the castle with them. The sheer logistical impossibility of it was an insult to her own central and cherished place in the universe. She raced through the empty, echoing house, her screams a frantic, hysterical and satisfying soundtrack to her own personal and long overdue apocalypse. She threw open the door to my bedroom. Empty. She ran upstairs to her own room, the one island of chaotic, messy and familiar reality in this sea of stark, shocking and utterly incomprehensible emptiness. The sight of her own untouched belongings seemed to confuse her even further. This was not a robbery. A robber would have taken her expensive laptop, her jewelry, her designer clothes. This was something else, something far more personal, more targeted, and more terrifying. Kyle, in the meantime, had been stumbling through the house in a state of dumb, slack-jawed shock. He was a man of simple, parasitic appetites, and his entire comfortable and unexamined world had just been vaporized. His brain, which was not designed for complex problem-solving, was simply and quietly shutting down. They finally and inevitably ended up back in the kitchen, the cold, sterile and symbolic heart of the empty house. Alicia was panting, her beautiful contoured face a mess of tears and mascara, her perfect party-ready facade completely and irrevocably shattered. And then, Kyle saw it. His eyes, which had been darting around the empty room with a look of pure animalistic panic, finally focused on the one, single, solitary object in the entire barren landscape. A small, white, and menacing piece of paper stuck to the front of the empty refrigerator. "Alicia," he whispered, his voice a dry, croaking and terrified thing. He pointed a trembling finger. "Look." She followed his gaze. She saw the note. She walked toward it, her movements now slow, robotic, a sleepwalker in her own personal and satisfying nightmare. She reached out a shaking red-nailed hand and pulled the paper towel, the last pathetic and symbolic remnant of her mother's domestic servitude, from the refrigerator door. She held it in her hand, her eyes scanning the two short, simple, and utterly devastating sentences, written in her mother's familiar, neat, and now terrifying script. "You wanted the house? It's all yours. The foreclosure notice is in the mail." The words were a quiet, simple, and utterly catastrophic explosion. The first sentence was a chilling, mocking, and satisfying echo of her own lifelong entitlement. The house was hers. Foreclosure. The word was a foreign object, a piece of a language she did not speak. But she understood its meaning. She had seen the signs on the lawns of other less fortunate people. It was a word of failure, of debt, of a world of adult and unpleasant consequences that she had never ever had to inhabit. The house was not a gift. It was a trap. It was a poisoned chalice. Her mother had not just left. She had bequeathed her a catastrophe. She had left her holding the bag, and the bag was on fire. The sheer brilliant and satisfying cruelty of it was a thing of terrible, beautiful, and utterly inescapable logic. And my daughter, my brilliant, arrogant, and now finally, and completely and utterly defeated daughter, simply and with a quiet, final, and satisfying sigh, slid down the side of the empty refrigerator and collapsed in a heap on the cold, hard, and unforgiving kitchen floor. The note on the refrigerator was the main event, the shocking central revelation of the evening's drama. But I, a woman who believed in the power of a thorough, well-documented presentation, had left behind a second, and equally devastating act. As Alicia sat on the cold linoleum floor, her mind a screaming, chaotic void of disbelief and dawning terrible comprehension, Kyle's eyes were drawn to the one other object that had been left in the otherwise barren kitchen. On the bare granite countertop where my old familiar fruit bowl used to sit, was a neat, thick, and official-looking stack of mail. It was the mail from the past week, the mail I had been quietly and strategically intercepting and hiding. It was a collection of stark white and menacing windowed envelopes, each one a small paper harbinger of their new and unpleasant reality. Kyle, his movements now slow and robotic, a man operating on pure terrified instinct, reached for the pile. He picked up the first and thickest envelope. It was from the city's property tax office. He tore it open. Inside was the annual, and now seriously overdue, property tax bill for the house. It was a staggering 5-figure sum, a number that, to a man like Kyle, whose primary source of income was his wife's mother, might as well have been $1 billion. And at the bottom of the bill, in a stark red and unforgiving font, was a new and even more terrifying number. The amount now due, including late fees and interest penalties. A low, guttural, and satisfying groan escaped his lips. He dropped the bill on the counter as if it were on fire. Alicia, roused from her state of catatonic shock by the sound of her husband's despair, looked up. "What is it?" she whispered. "The taxes," he croaked, his voice a dry, rasping thing. We owe thousands in taxes." But they were just getting started. Kyle reached for the next envelope. It was from the homeowner's insurance company. The annual premium, another 4-figure sum, was also now past due, and the letter contained a polite but firm warning that if the balance was not paid within the next 10 days, the policy would be cancelled, leaving the house, their new and indebted asset, completely and terrifyingly uninsured. And then, the final, and most brutal letter. It was a thick, heavy, and intimidating envelope, sent by registered mail from the legal department of the bank that held the home equity loan. Kyle tore it open, his hands shaking so violently that he almost ripped the contents. Inside was a stark, legal, and utterly non-negotiable document. It was a formal and final notice of foreclosure. It laid out in cold, hard, and unforgiving legal language the full catastrophic scope of their new and self-inflicted problem. It detailed the history of the missed payments, the default on the loan, and the bank's legal and now imminent right to seize and sell the property to recoup its losses. The date for the foreclosure auction was set for just 3 weeks away. The full, beautiful, and satisfying horror of their situation had finally, and with a brutal mathematical clarity, been laid bare. They had not inherited a house. They had inherited a massive, empty, and rapidly depreciating liability. A house that was uninsured, that had thousands of dollars in back taxes due, and that was in less than a month going to be sold out from under them. The house was not a home. It was a countdown. A ticking time bomb of debt, of legal fees, of a financial and personal ruin so complete, so absolute, that it was a thing of terrible, beautiful, and satisfying genius. My daughter, who had so arrogantly and so cruelly demanded control of my paycheck, was now the sole and unwilling proprietor of my debt. The bills for the first and final time in her life were now officially hers to pay. The scream that Alicia let out this time was different. It was not the shriek of a baffled angry queen. It was the raw, primal and satisfying cry of a cornered animal, a creature that has just realized that the beautiful, safe and familiar forest it has always known is, in fact, a complex and inescapable trap. The legal, bureaucratic and impersonal language of the foreclosure notice was a new and, for her, entirely terrifying form of violence. The rage, the indignation, the entire arsenal of her aggressive emotional weaponry was useless against it. You cannot argue with a default notice. You cannot bully a tax bill. Her first and only instinct was to find the person who could fix this. The person who had always fixed everything. Her mother. She snatched her phone, her hands shaking so violently that she could barely unlock it. She found my contact, the number that had for so long been her direct line to a world of easy, unconditional and taken-for-granted solutions, and she pressed call. The sound that met her was not my familiar, and now yearned for, voice. It was a cold, robotic and satisfying recorded message. The number you have dialed has been disconnected or is no longer in service. The finality of it, the sheer technological and impersonal brutality of it, was a new and for her entirely incomprehensible cruelty. She had not just been left, she had been erased, blocked, excised from my life with the clean, surgical and satisfying precision of a digital command. She tried again, a frantic, desperate and utterly futile gesture. The result was the same. Her next call was to her Aunt Denise. Denise, her sharp, practical and now terrifyingly complicit Aunt Denise, who always answered her phone. The result was the same. A disconnected number, blocked. The walls of her world, which had already been stripped bare, were now officially closing in. The two adult and relied upon pillars of her support system had, in a single coordinated and satisfying act of rebellion, vanished from her universe. She was completely and utterly alone. The panic, now a wild, screaming and satisfying thing, propelled her to her last and most pathetic resort. Her friends, the glamorous fair weather and self-absorbed audience for her lifelong performance. She began to call them, one by one, her voice a high, frantic and unattractive wail of pure, unadulterated and satisfying desperation. The conversations, I can only imagine, were a masterpiece of social and awkward comedy. "Stacy? Oh my God, you are not going to believe what my psycho mother just did. She moved out and took everything, and now there's this foreclosure thing. Can I come stay with you?" The excuses, I am sure, were a symphony of polite and insincere regrets. "Oh my God, Tiff. That's insane. I'd love to, but my own crazy family is all here. There's literally no room." "Aw, sweetie, that's so wild. We're actually just heading out of town to go to my fiancé's parents' place. So sorry." Her crisis was a story, a juicy, delicious and satisfying piece of gossip. It was not a problem they were willing to own. They were the audience in the show. Her show had just become a little too real, a little too messy and a little too poor. She was not just a friend in need. She was a liability, a social and now apparently a financial leper. And her friends, her beautiful, loyal and shallow friends, were backing away, slowly at first, and then with a great and satisfying rush. The isolation was not just a feeling, it was a fact. A cold, hard and satisfying fact. The final and most exquisite act of their humiliation was one they had arranged themselves. The party. The epic Christmas Eve party for Alicia's influencer friends. The very event that had been the catalyst for this entire glorious and satisfying implosion. At around 9 o'clock, just as the full, profound and satisfying horror of their situation had begun to truly and with a brutal, chilling finality sink in, the doorbell rang. It was the first of their guests. A young, impossibly cool and self-absorbed couple dressed in the height of ironic high-fashion festive attire. They stood on the porch, a bottle of expensive craft gin in hand, their faces alight with the expectation of a glamorous, exclusive and Instagrammable party. And then, Alicia opened the door. The scene that greeted them was not one of a chic, curated and enviable holiday gathering. It was a scene of a profound and unsettling domestic and financial apocalypse. The house was dark. The only light a cold, single and unflattering beam from Alicia's phone flashlight. The air was frigid. The rooms behind her were a vast, echoing and creepy void. And Alicia herself, the glamorous, confident and aspirational hostess, was a wreck. Her perfect contoured makeup was a mess of tear-streaked, mascara-stained ruin. Her beautiful party-ready dress was rumpled, and her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated and satisfying despair. Tiff, The young man had apparently stammered his cool, ironic detachment completely, and instantly shattered. "Is everything okay?" And with that the dam of Alicia's fragile and now completely and utterly broken composure had burst. The story had tumbled out, a messy, incoherent, and pathetic torrent of tears, of blame, of a self-pity so profound, so absolute, that it was a thing of terrible, beautiful, and satisfying art. The friends of, and they had fled, as if the house itself were a source of a contagious and virulent poverty. But they had of course texted everyone else on the guest list. And so for the next hour, Alicia and Kyle had been forced to stand at the door of their cold, dark and empty house, and greet a steady stream of their beautiful, trendy and horrified friends. They had to explain, over and over and over again, the story of their own spectacular and satisfying social and financial demise. Each new arrival was a fresh wave of humiliation, a new and satisfying twist of the knife. Each car that pulled up, each confused, pitying and satisfying look on the faces of their former acolytes was another small and satisfying death. By 10 o'clock the arrivals had stopped. The street outside was quiet again. The party was officially and with a beautiful, satisfying and cathartic finality over before it had even begun. Alicia and Kyle were left completely and utterly alone, in the cold, dark and empty shell of their former life. The brand had not been launched. It had been in the most public and the most humiliating way imaginable. Liquidated, their parasitic and satisfyingly doomed existence had been, abruptly and brutally terminated. Christmas Eve, the night of their greatest and most arrogant social ambition, had become the night of their own, personal and satisfying rock bottom. While my daughter was descending into her own private and deserved circle of hell, I was in heaven. My heaven was a quiet, elegant and beautifully furnished two-bedroom condo in a luxury retirement community in Annapolis, overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. It was a world away from the chaotic and exhausting drama of my former life. The contrast between her Christmas Eve and mine was a thing of a stark, beautiful and satisfying poetry. Her house was cold, mine was warm, the thermostat set to a perfect, comfortable and unapologetic 72 degrees. Her house was dark. Mine was full of a soft, warm and festive light. A small, elegant and beautifully decorated Christmas tree stood in the corner, its white lights twinkling, a quiet and personal celebration of my own new and blessedly solitary freedom. Her house was empty. Mine was full of beautiful new and comfortable furniture, all of it chosen by me. For me, it was a space that was a perfect and satisfying reflection of my own quiet and understated taste. Her house was silent, a tomb of her own dead ambitions. Mine was filled with the sound of a quiet, classical and moving Christmas music, playing softly from a state-of-the-art and easy-to-use sound system. She was alone, a prisoner of her own, and self-inflicted isolation. I was with my sister Denise, the one true and loyal ally in my life. We sat at a small, elegant and intimate dining table. A table set for two. We were not eating a burnt and resented pot roast. We were enjoying a quiet, elegant and delicious Christmas Eve dinner of crab cakes and a crisp, cold and satisfying Sauvignon Blanc. "To new beginnings," Denise had said, raising her glass, her eyes shining with a fierce and loving pride. "To new beginnings," I had repeated, my voice a little thick with a new and for me entirely unfamiliar and satisfying emotion. A quiet, profound and satisfying joy. We ate in a comfortable, easy and satisfying silence, the only sound the soft clinking of our silverware and the beautiful soaring and moving notes of the choir on the stereo. There was no drama, there was no tension, there was no performance, there was just the simple, beautiful and satisfying peace of two sisters sharing a meal in a safe, warm and happy home. After dinner we sat on my small private balcony, wrapped in soft cashmere blankets, and we looked out at the dark, quiet and calming waters of the bay. The air was cold, but it was a clean, fresh and invigorating cold. It was the cold of a new and promising winter. "Do you think she's okay?" I had asked. The question a small and for me entirely involuntary flicker of my old and ingrained maternal concern. Denise had looked at me, her expression a mixture of a sisterly love and a firm and necessary dose of reality. "No, Bren," she had said, her voice gentle but firm, "she is not okay, and that is the best and most necessary Christmas gift you have ever given her." And I knew, with a certainty that was as calm and as clear as the dark, quiet and satisfying water before me, that she was absolutely and completely and satisfyingly right. The new sanctuary was not just for me, it was in its own brutal and necessary way, for her too. The final and most satisfying act of my liberation took place a month after that quiet, peaceful and restorative Christmas. The foreclosure on my old Baltimore row house, a process I had set in motion with a cold and satisfying sense of purpose, was complete. The house, the scene of so much of my own personal and exhausting domestic servitude, was no longer mine. It now belonged to the bank, a cold, impersonal and unsentimental entity. The news of the final sale reached me through my lawyer. The house had been sold at auction for a price that had more than covered the outstanding balance of the home equity loan I had so strategically and so brilliantly defaulted on. The remaining and not insignificant proceeds from the sale had been deposited, as per my instructions, into my new secret and satisfyingly untouchable private account. I had in essence been paid to evict my own parasitic and ungrateful daughter. The beautiful, elegant and satisfying irony of it all was not lost on me. I received a letter, of course. It had been forwarded from my old address. It was a long, rambling and self-pitying screed from Alicia. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic and delusional revisionist history. It was full of blame for me, for Kyle, whom she had, I heard, already left, for the unfairness of the world, for the cruelty of a universe that had not in the end bent to her will. It was the letter of a woman who had learned absolutely and completely and satisfyingly nothing. I read the first few sentences and I felt a profound and satisfying and final wave of nothing. The power she had held over me, the power to hurt me, to disappoint me, to exhaust me, was gone. She was a stranger, a sad, angry and uninteresting stranger, and her problems were no longer mine to solve. I did not finish the letter. I simply, and with a quiet and satisfying sense of finality, tore it into small, neat and satisfying pieces, and I dropped it into the trash. The conversation was over. The file was closed, the mess was finally, and with a beautiful, satisfying and cathartic finality, cleaned up. That same afternoon I went to a community center in a part of Baltimore that the tour buses always avoided. It was a place of a quiet and inspiring hope, a place that ran a program for young single mothers, a program that provided job training, childcare and assistance in securing stable, affordable housing. I met with the director, a tired but fiercely and dedicated woman who was running a miracle on a shoestring budget. I had a check with me. It was not a small and insignificant check. It was a large and life-altering one. It was for the full and satisfying amount of the proceeds from the sale of my old and memory-filled house. I would like to make a donation, I had said, my voice quiet but firm. I would like to fund your housing program for the next 10 years. The look on her face, a look of a pure, unadulterated and moving joy, was the greatest and most satisfying return on investment I had ever received. I was a builder, after all. My late husband Robert and I, we had spent our lives building a home, a foundation for our family. That foundation had crumbled, not because of a flaw in the design, but because of a rot in the very material it was meant to support. But a good architect, a good builder, does not just walk away from a failed project. They salvage the materials, and they build something new, something stronger, something better, something that will last. I looked out the window of the community center at the bustling and vibrant life of the city that had been my home for so long, and I smiled. A quiet, peaceful and satisfying smile. I had finally, and with a beautiful, satisfying and cathartic finality, found a worthy and deserving cause, a new foundation, a new home, not just for me, but for 100 other women who were just trying to build a life, a future for their own and loved children. It was the best and most satisfying investment I had ever made. Thank you for watching.